D. James Kennedy Ministries presents Truths That Transform.
Liberty is somewhat like the air we breathe. It is everywhere. We take it for granted until we lose it.
The ACLU is not the protector of Americans' civil liberties. Veterans are. Veterans protected America's freedom.
This is Truths That Transform.
On the other hand, we in
Thank you for joining us on Truths That Transform, a viewer-supported program. I am Frank Wright, president of D. James Kennedy Ministries, and I invite you to visit our website at djameskennedy.org, where you can find a deep library of video, audio, digital, and print resources. Visit us at djameskennedy.org. On this Memorial Day weekend, we pause to remember the sacrifice of those great patriots who have given everything to defend and preserve our God-given freedoms. Each of us who lives and worships freely today owes a debt of gratitude to these great Americans. Sadly, we live in a generation that is beginning to lose those dearly bought freedoms. As we have forgotten the source of our freedom as a nation, we've seen it begin to evaporate, particularly our dearest freedom enshrined in the First Amendment, our religious liberty. I recently had a chance to sit down with Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council, to talk about where these things stand. What should it look like for the Christian living in a culture like this that's tilting against truth? In fact, this culture is running headlong away from any notion of biblical morality, but it's also now no longer debating the ideas of faith. They're attacking faith as hateful, shameful, evil even.
Let me be very clear, Frank, and I know you agree with this. I know Dr. Kennedy would agree with this. Our salvation does not come from Washington, D.C. And I don't mean our eternal salvation. I'm talking about even our present salvation. But we have seen such an increase in hostility toward religious freedom and expression in this country that the ability to freely live out our faith in a way that impacts the world around us for Christ is at risk. And we can either stop that by those we elect in office who understand our First Amendment freedoms and are willing to defend them, or we can see those freedoms continue to disintegrate as we allow those to be elected who are hostile toward the expression of the Christian faith.
You've seen the controversy over the last few decades among Christians who believe that our focus should be on the gospel of Jesus Christ and leave the politics out of it and keep politics out of the church. Dr. Kennedy used to laugh at that and say that it's politics that stuck its nose in the business of the church, not the other way around.
Here's how I see this. As growing up, I watched Dr. Kennedy and had such a great appreciation for him. He was one of the few men in America in the church that got it. From this standpoint, who can argue with him about his heart for evangelism? I mean, he launched Evangelism Explosion. I mean, he was about winning souls for Christ, but at the same time, he understood we had to impact the culture. The two are not incompatible. They run together, they're parallel, and that's a part of the Great Commission. You don't choose one or the other, you do both. Now, you may have an emphasis on one or the other, but look, I understand that we have to win the hearts and minds of people into the kingdom of God. But once they're there, what do we do with them? They shouldn't still be conducting business the way they did before. That's a part of the cultural commission, is that we need to train people. As Jesus said, teach them all things that I have taught you. And part of that is impacting the world around us with truth. We are not disqualified from engaging in the public square simply because we're Christian. And that's where we're at today, where people want us to check our Christian faith at the door of even public service, not just holding public office, but if you're a fireman, a policeman, a teacher, you're supposed to, a football coach, you're supposed to leave your faith at home or within the confines of the church. Right. Totally contrary to what the founders envisioned. Right. And I would argue, Frank, totally contrary to what God has called us to do.
Yeah, reminds us of Newhouse's comment about the naked public square. You can practice your faith as long as you do that in private, so no one has to see you do that. But you wonder whether the day will come where even that is a risky thing, where your private practice of your faith in your home will not be tolerated either if it subscribes to historic Christian truths.
We see this administration, we see the left creating these spiritual ghettos, where we are forced into these, confined to these areas, trying to quarantine faith so it's more easily controllable. And with that comes a marginalization and a stigmatizing of our faith so that the next generation wants to avoid it. I mean, that's what we've seen in our public schools, where kids who pray are chastised, those who carry their Bible are marked. Therefore, it's like, don't touch that, that's bad. And now we're seeing it in our nation's military. It's made its way all the way up through the ranks of our society.
What's one thing, Tony, that if people understood better would get them on their knees in prayer and on their feet in the voting booth in this forthcoming election?
I go back to what William Wilberforce said, the English statesman, who, when he was discussing his role as a member of the Parliament, and he said, you know, and I paraphrase, but he said, you know, I tremble with every vote that I cast, knowing that I will give an account to God. I think we need to move toward the voting booth with that sense of really fear that we will give an account. Are we voting for who's going to give us the most goodies? Who's going to increase government programs? Are we voting based upon God's principles of righteousness and how this nation might be used to advance truth, freedom around the world so that others might come to know Christ? I believe as Christians, each and every one of us will give an account for every vote that we cast.
Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God's. To whom much is given, much is required. We really live in a time of opportunity, don't we? Not a time of hand-wringing, a time of opportunity.
It is a dark time, but it's so easy for our light to be seen in the darkness. And even, even a dim bulb can be seen in pitch darkness. And so this is an opportunity for us to shine. And I would say this, Frank, I believe as we continue to see cultural implosion, the fraying of the fabric of America, that people are going to be looking for a sense of hope. And we're told as Christians to be able to give a reason for the hope that is within us. Well, that suggests a couple of things. One, that people should see the hope that's in us. And in the midst of that, ask us, why are you so calm? Why do you have a sense of peace? Why are you not all upset? And then we get a chance to tell them exactly why. And that's where I believe we should be today.
While Christians in many generations have suffered persecution, and while the church is not dependent on political freedom, we were given a tremendous gift by our forefathers. Unique in world history, America was settled by Christians seeking to freely worship God. And our founding fathers enshrined that freedom into the Constitution. It's a way of life that hundreds of thousands of Americans have died for on distant battlefields. On this Memorial Day weekend, we dare not forget, as my friend Dr. D. James Kennedy called it, the cost of freedom.
What has happened to that burning flame of liberty that so moved the founders of this country? I'm afraid the flame is burning very weakly in America today. Liberty. Abraham Lincoln said, "Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in what? In liberty." And our Declaration says that next to life itself, the most important right we have is liberty. And if you look at the Bible, you will find what many scholars agree to be the major theme of the entire Old and New Testaments. It is liberty, freedom. Did you ever think about that? One great truth that Americans have forgotten, I believe, is that the source of the liberty that we have has come from one place only. It has come from God. It has come from Christ, who alone can make people free. And everywhere that people are free, it is because believers have been willing to put it on the line and to stand up before the tyrant and say, "No farther shalt thou go." Having been made free in their souls, that creates an irresistible urge for civil and political freedom, especially wherever the pure gospel of Jesus Christ, the reformed gospel of Christ, with all of its emphasis upon grace and the cross, wherever that has gone, it has been followed by civil and political liberty. And we are very quickly throwing our religious liberty overboard. And you should also remember that when religious liberty goes, other liberties follow. There are many in our country that have sunk so far below religious liberty that they're not even up to the element of religious toleration. There are many in this country today that won't even tolerate religion, most especially Christianity. I think of the father of modern education, John Dewey, the father of modern progressive education, who is so lionized in our country today and has been for many, many years. And yet Dewey and the various leaders of the progressive education movement have said, quote, "There is no God and there is no soul. Hence, there are no needs for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, then immutable truth is also dead and buried. There is no room for fixed natural law or moral absolutes." And that statement made by Dewey could just as easily have come out of the mouth of Hitler or Marx or anyone else like that. By the way, I asked someone today, what was communism all about? What were they trying to do? Was it something to do with economics? He wasn't really sure. And I said, well, let me give it to you from the lips of Karl Marx himself. When asked by a reporter what he was trying to do, he said that he was attempting to dethrone God and destroy capitalism. Notice the order of priority. Yes, my friends, I think Americans have come to the place where they take their religious freedom far too much for granted. And today, many people look upon religion as an evil, not even to be tolerated, but to be removed. Folks, when our religious freedom disappears, all other freedoms follow soon after.
As Dr. Kennedy points out, when we forget the source of our freedoms begin to disappear along with Him who graciously gave them. And as you're about to see, in our nation, there is a contingent actively pursuing the secularization of America. They seek to strip any mention of God and Christianity from the public square, even changing our history as they do so.
Memorial Day is connected obviously to our veterans, and we are having just a slew of cases that we're having to defend because there's a lot of imagery connected with our veterans that are religious, like crosses, and Stars of David. You'll see these in cemeteries. around the country and around the world that are U.S. cemeteries for our fallen heroes. It's littered throughout the history of our country. The cross is a symbol of sacrifice. And the ACLU and some of these groups, the atheist groups, don't want there to be crosses. They don't want them to be in public. They want them taken down. There's all kinds of things that are starting to happen that really have never happened in the history of this country because religious freedom, and in particular, especially Christianity, are under attack.
It's often been noted that it's the soldier that keeps us free, not the politician, not the journalist, not the teacher, not the minister. And sometimes soldiers, when they return from overseas, they'll build memorials to honor their fallen brethren. Some of those memorials include religious symbols, and that is anathema to groups like the ACLU, especially if it's a cross.
The ACLU, because of its fanaticism, has become the Taliban of American liberal secularism.
Reese Lloyd should know. He was once an ACLU attorney in the early 1980s.
When I left there, I saw the beginnings of this church-state operation, which was something that I really didn't want to have anything to do with.
A longtime civil rights attorney, Lloyd has been active with the American Legion, a veterans organization with about 2.5 million members. He says that all veterans' memorials and national cemeteries are now under threat of desecration by the ACLU and their ilk simply because they bear religious symbols.
As Americans, I think we're generally repelled by the notion of ethnic cleansing. We should be equally appalled at the notion of secular cleansing of our history, and that's precisely what's happening.
Consider for a moment the ACLU's battle against a cross that was erected in the Mojave Desert in California in 1934 by World War I veterans.
They put up a lone 7-foot cross in the middle of the desert, very remote. And on the bottom it just had a statement that said, "For the dead of all wars," and had their VFW post. And it sat there for over 70 years until the ACLU brought a lawsuit saying, hey, you can't have this cross on government land.
When we're looking at the Mojave Desert Cross, a simple wooden cross on the top of a mountain in the middle of the Mojave Desert that only rattlesnakes and spiders got to look at half the time.
The ACLU seized the opportunity to make a lot of money and to establish a dangerous precedent. They filed a lawsuit, said it's federal land now. That's endorsement of religion.
And they actually went into court and unbelievably got an order to have it torn down.
And a federal judge, once he was told about it by an ACLU attorney, this federal judge required that a bag be put over top of the cross itself.
When people were so offended when they saw that, the court ordered that it actually be covered and contained in a plywood box. So you would go out and look at that memorial that had been there for over 70 years, and you wouldn't see the cross, the memorial. You would see a bolted box around what used to be this memorial cross. We said, we've got to go to the Supreme Court. This has got to be overturned. And we did go to the Supreme Court. The court did rule that this was a wrong decision by the Ninth Circuit. They overruled the decision to tear down this Veterans Memorial that had been up for, by that point, over 75 years. And they upheld it. They upheld it 5-4. That tells you how close we are. But it was a victory. And so the box came off, the bag came off, and then vandals went into the desert in the middle of the night and actually tore down that memorial that had been up for so many years and took it away.
But supporters were soon able to come up with a new cross to be erected in its place.
And to our shock, the Obama administration refused to allow us to put that memorial, that cross, back up. And so we actually had to file a lawsuit against them after winning the other lawsuit. The good news is, finally, after essentially 10 years of this battle, on Veterans Day of 2012, that memorial went back up. That cross came back up in front of a national satellite feed all across the country, and that memorial is now back up to stay.
But the battle over the memorial crosses continues as the ACLU and like-minded legal groups set their sights on crosses in city seals and on other memorial crosses, and then some. At Normandy Beach, there are 9,000 upright crosses and Stars of David, which can be seen for miles. Because they are considered government property, they too are all vulnerable.
What is going on today in this country is we're having a very concerted effort by some very powerful and well-funded organizations that are intent on removing any display of religion in this country. So much so that before long we may be having to bulldoze things like the Argonne Cross in Arlington National Cemetery. Perhaps we may even have to sandblast the word God off of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Or perhaps we might even have to take down crosses that have been put up in memorial of soldiers everywhere.
The ACLU is not the protector of Americans' civil liberties. Veterans are. Veterans protected America's freedom and the civil liberties of every American, including those conscienceless, disrespectful, arrogant, elitists, social engineers in the ACLU. They'd have no civil liberties if it were not for these veterans who stood up, put their lives on the line, and served when their country called. And the disrespect they have shown in attacking a veterans memorial will never be forgiven nor forgotten. They have crossed the line.
Why do we have secularist and atheist organizations in this country so intent on telling our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine how to mourn, how to remember those that have fallen with them? It takes a special brand of hubris for an organization to say that we're going to tell you how to remember those who fought beside you, and say that you can't remember them with a simple cross.
It is unconscionable in a nation founded upon religious liberty that the movement to completely strip God, religion, and specifically Christianity out of our public life is gaining such steam. These attempts to marginalize and silence Christianity are not new. In fact, it was recently discovered that the IRS was using its vast power to harass conservative and Christian groups that disagree with the current administration. It's time to stand up and put a stop to such abuses. My very dear friend Jennifer Kennedy Cassidy is here to tell us more. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you to all of you who put your lives on the line to defend our liberties, and to those of you who've lost loved ones fighting for us. We honor your sacrifice today. And because freedom is so costly, we each have a responsibility to be good stewards of the liberty that's been given to us. For decades, the threat of IRS investigation and the loss of tax exemption have been used to silence pastors and churches on key moral issues of the day. A law put forward by Lyndon Johnson when he was in Congress allowed the IRS to go after churches who opposed his liberal policies. And today, that threat is still used against churches and pastors who dare speak out on political issues. But the Bible says that the church is to teach the nations everything Christ has commanded. It's time we began obeying the Bible and standing up to this bully tactic from the government. We have put together an urgent petition we want you to sign, calling upon your leaders in Washington, D.C. to support the House of Worship Free Speech Restoration Act. The bill that's been proposed would protect churches from harassment and silencing by the IRS. Please contact us to receive your petitions to your senators and representatives, sign them, and return them right away. So many have died so we can be free. The least we can do is stand up for our freedom. Simply write to us at Box 6084, Albert Lea, Minnesota, 56007, or call toll-free 877-962-7677, or go online at djameskennedy.org. And if you're able to give a generous donation to the ongoing work of this ministry when you contact us, we will also send you a copy of the hard-hitting book, The IRS Exposed. Not only has the IRS been used as a weapon to silence churches, but recent evidence has shown that they've also targeted conservative Christian groups for audit. It's an outrageous abuse of power, and it's crucial that you know what's going on so they can't take your freedom away. We'll send you the petitions calling for protection for churches against the IRS, as well as the powerful book, The IRS Exposed, as our thanks for your generous donation. Simply write to us at Box 6084, Albert Lea, Minnesota, 56007, or call toll-free 877-962-7677 or go online at djameskennedy.org.
Recently, Dr. Eric Walsh, a respected public health physician, was fired from an appointment as the district health director for Northwest Georgia. The reason? Allegedly, it was because Dr. Walsh is also a pastor and has preached sermons from his pulpit affirming the biblical view of marriage and sexuality. Georgia officials asked for copies of those sermons, and a team of government workers was assigned to pore through them. Dr. Walsh was then fired. In Houston, Texas recently, the homosexual mayor there had subpoenas issued for sermon transcripts from 5 pastors. Those pastors were active in opposing a bill that would have allowed men identifying as female to use women's public restroom facilities. The mayor dropped the subpoenas only after a public outcry. Let us not be naive and think that these are isolated cases. The organized efforts to brand biblical values as hateful and intolerant has always had the goal of suppressing those views by force of law. This is why, for instance, a Christian baker must be forced to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. It's not enough for the enforcers of tolerance for such weddings to be allowed. They must also be approved and celebrated by all. Dissent will be crushed. If the First Amendment protects anything, it would be the sermons of pastors. Yet there's no boundary line the new political correctness won't cross. Rather than being cowed into silence, now is the time for millions of Christians and their pastors to stand boldly and clearly for the Word of God. Those who would bully the church into silence are expecting quiet acquiescence. We dare not give it to them. Too many have given too much for our sake and for the sake of religious freedom to squander that heritage. Remember, freedom once lost is rarely regained. I'm Frank Wright. Thanks for joining us on Truths That Transform. We'll see you next time.
Next week on Truths That Transform.
We are called to remembrance, to remember Him who has blessed this nation and made it great.
When you look at the redefinitions of some of our most sacred institutions legally, it's a pretty good, deep crisis hour in our nation.
That's next week. Today's program is available on DVD for your gift to this ministry of any amount. Please call, write, or log on to our website today. This has been a production of D. James Kennedy Ministries.